Hello and welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 12 of The Silver Chair, The Queen of the Underland.
Oof, this is a great chapter. So great, in fact, we had to bring in a special guest.
Yes, we have a special guest with us today. We have the Reverend Dan Marotta, who is a priest in the Anglican Church in North America. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Thanks, fellas. Glad to be here. This is great.
We are really excited to have you on the show, especially for a chapter that is, there's so much incredible theology that Lewis has for us today, so I cannot wait to jump into it.
I'm looking forward to unpacking this with someone who's a little bit more well-read than we are.
A little bit? Are you looking at me like it's someone who is much more? Yes, so...
you guys are making me nervous. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, Dan, before we jump into chapter 12, we'd love to get to know you a little bit better. So whenever we have guests on for the first time, we always like to ask them two main questions, and then we have a special question for you. So just first off, can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with the Chronicles of Narnia? How did you first encounter them?
Sure. By the way, I love the way you asked that question. My relationship with the Chronicles of Narnia. I love it. It is a relationship. So grew up in a family where my mom was a former teacher and loved reading, and just had the privilege of growing up in a house where we were introduced to good books early on. And so my first encounter with C.S. Lewis and Narnia was my mom reading bedtime stories to me and to my siblings. And so for a lot of the characters, when I think about their voice, I actually still just hear my mother's sort of attempt at, making up a voice for, for the beavers or for, Caspian or, one of the characters. And so, that was my first encounter with Narnia. That's where it all started.
That's awesome. This as a little subset to that first question, then you have 4 children of your own. Have you already begun introducing them to the books?
Oh, you know it, man. So my oldest child, my oldest daughter, has already read, and you're going to think I'm exaggerating. I promise I'm not. I think she's already read all of the Chronicles 4 times through.
Whoa.
She devours books.
And she's only 4 years old, which is crazy. Just kidding.
She's 9.
Yeah.
And then my next oldest child, my second oldest daughter, we are in the middle of reading through them together. And we have almost finished Voyage of the Dawn Treader. So we've been kind of working our way through each one of them. So we're about halfway through with her.
That's awesome. That's great. Well, as you read these through with your children, do you have a favorite book or, one that stands out to you as the best one to get into with your children?
Yeah. Oh, well, gosh. Okay. Those are sort of maybe 2 different questions.
Favorite
one
and then
best
questions.
One for children. Yeah. My favorite one ever, it's funny. I've actually over the years been asked that a number of times whenever somebody hears that I really like C.S. Lewis. And I feel like my answer is always disappointing for other people. The Horse and His Boy is far and away my favorite out of the Chronicles. But I always get grief from folks because I feel like a lot of other folks, it's like their least favorite.
This is a safe space.
Oh, sorry, what's that?
This is a safe space. You don't have to worry about that. Mainly because neither of us has read that book.
Oh, okay.
We don't know how it fits in with the others.
There you go. It takes place chronologically while the 4 original children from Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe are still in Narnia, reigning on the throne as kings.
Yeah,
and queens.
during the Golden Age, right?
Oh wow,
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
So if we were in Lost, it would be like a flash sideways. Like, here's what's happening in the meantime. Yeah.
You have no idea how much that metaphor means to Daniel.
It means a lot to both of us. So what about with your kids, though? So if Horse and His Boy is your favorite, what about reading with your children?
I think Voyage of the Dawn Treader is most conducive to bedtime stories. Because the story so naturally breaks up into episodes, and so you can just hit an episode in a night. It'll only take you maybe 15 minutes to read through, all that happens on whatever particular island they've landed on, and then you can kind of, move on.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm gonna go with that. That's final answer for kids' bedtime
good.
stories.
Are you yay or nay on the duffel puds? This was a big controversy in the last season.
Yay or nay? What does that even mean? Do I like them? Do I not like them?
Do you like them?
Are you for them or are you against them?
Yeah. I was pretty openly not a huge fan of the duffel puds. I found them annoying, and the rest of our listeners did not agree with me.
Oh my goodness. I mean, they're great comic relief. Yeah, I mean, gosh, to me, reading about the duffel puds is like reading, like what do kids think of their parents? Like from a kid's point of view, it's like kids think their parents are these like malicious overlords that are always out to like take away the good stuff, and I don't know. So
yeah, that's a great way to put it. Maybe.
We're only in the like getting to know each other phase of this, and we already have a great example of like a great illustration of what that is. I love that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. This is all about our fallen nature, right? Well, Dan, you are an ordained priest in the Anglican Church in North America, and so I would love to know. You often, Lewis was an Anglican. Although obviously he focused a lot on mere Christianity, but I would love to know how C.S. Lewis has shaped your ministry and your role as a rector of a church, as a pastor to others.
Sure. Gosh, it's a charitable question. So I would say he certainly had a role. I mean, I think Narnia. I think the gift of Narnia for children is that it helps shape their imaginations, and I feel like I'm the one of many benefactors of that. And so I would say, yeah, it probably starts with Narnia, and we might get into this later in the episode because I think it relates to the chapter that we're going to talk about. But one of the things that I think the Narnia series does is for kids, it makes them wish it was real. Kids read Narnia, adults read Narnia, and you just have this sense of like, gosh, I wish this was a real place. I wish I could go. I wish I could visit. And, of course, for someone who's maybe involved in any kind of discipleship ministry in a church, the next obvious statement would be like, well, Narnia might not be real, but something even better actually is. And so I would say that step of starting with imagination and starting with beauty and starting with a desirable world as a starting place for discipleship, as a starting place for ministry. I think C.S. Lewis does that so well in his writing, and I feel like I've benefited from that and would like to emulate it. I don't know if I'm able to, but would like to. And then you reference Mere Christianity, which I think is a really excellent book. And when I was going through my seminary studies, I was trying to figure out where I could serve. It was sort of one of those places in life where you're sort of doing what so many people do, I think both Christian and unchristian, which is you're just like looking up at the sky saying, what should I do? Where should I go? What sort of job should I take? And one of the things that I stumbled across really through the kindness of some friends, some really, really wonderful friends, was I discovered what I'm sure so many other people already knew, was that C.S. Lewis was formed and shaped by the Anglican Church. And I think, Daniel, you and I have talked about this, but he didn't even really like his Anglican parish all that much. Yet the Anglican approach to worship and spiritual formation was still very impactful on him. I remember reading Letters to Malcolm, which is a book that C.S. Lewis wrote on prayer, and he referenced in there this little bit about liturgy and why he thought people shouldn't innovate very much when it comes to a church worship service. And he has this wonderful little quip where he kind of says, "The Lord said, 'Feed my sheep, not experiment on my rats.'" And it was kind of his sort of humorous way of saying, if you're a pastor and you're leading in ministry, you're always going to be tempted to try new stuff and to innovate and to try something creative that nobody else has tried before. But what you're really trying to do in ministry is you're trying to, really, get out of the way and let people encounter the living God. And as long as you're innovating and trying new things, you're really keeping the attention focused on yourself. People are looking at you, they're not looking at God. And his biggest critique of his own little Anglican parish priest was he wanted the guy to stop trying new stuff and just kind of get on with it so that he could focus on worship and not focus on who the priest was. And I read that and I thought, gosh, I probably have spent too much of my time in ministry trying to think of something creative and innovative when really my role is to, facilitate an interaction between God and people. And if people's attention is focused on me, I'm just going to get in my own way on that. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but it was C.S. Lewis that kind of helped frame my thinking on that. And ended up being part of the thing that led me into a more liturgical tradition, which is what the Anglican communion is.
That's a really great answer, Dan. I really appreciate that. And you and I have talked about Lewis's relationship with his own parish there in Oxford. Actually, I don't know if you've said this on the show before, but do you remember this, Phil? When we got to meet Gresham last fall in Montreat, he told us about, he gave us like this insider info when the group of us were all hanging out together one of those nights. And he said that in the parish that Lewis attended, there in Oxford, if you go, there's like a little plaque in one of the seats. It's like, this is where C.S. Lewis usually sat. You can go see it and people visit it. And Douglas Gresham, Lewis's stepson, said that's actually not true. He sat one row off of that because he wanted to sit in an obstructed seat so he wouldn't have to see the priest when he gave his sermon.
That's so great. I love it.
But then the parish didn't necessarily want to acknowledge that. So Gresham joked, he's like, I don't know if they moved it up on accident or if it was on purpose or wherever that they moved it one pew away from the place. But yeah, Lewis did have somewhat of a unique relationship with his own little parish there.
Can I just say that gives me so much comfort as a pastor because there's an example of a really wonderful Christian man who went to church even though he didn't like his pastor, and it's just great. Yeah. I love it, man.
That's good.
Dan, I really appreciate you just giving that background. I feel like it helps me understand a little bit more kind of the appeal behind liturgy in general and just why some people may be attracted to that. So I really appreciate that. I also find it interesting that, to me, what was always nice about services that did something different was that it kind of presented the same information in a new way. And it's funny to me that Lewis is someone that I think of as doing that all the time. All 7 books, I haven't read them all, but so far, the first 4 have presented stuff that I already know or that I thought I already knew, but in a different enough way that it makes me think again. When you're talking about Aslan, it's very different than when you're reading the same Bible verse, especially for someone who grew up going to church. So, just you hear stuff enough, maybe you stop hearing it as you should, or it's not as fresh sounding, which is just like, that's not a critique of scripture. That's a critique of just like how a human mind works. You get used to stuff. But to me, Lewis is someone who, he took stuff and then presented it in a new way. It's funny that he wanted the newness to get out of the way so we could get back to the worship. It's fun.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost as if it's not necessarily that he has some kind of fresh take. I mean, that isn't. I mean, Lewis spent so much of his career, both as a writer and as an academic, with his head in the Middle Ages, right? And what he's even doing with Narnia. We're going to see it later in this chapter. I can't wait to unpack some of the things that we're going to get into. As he's taking these ancient and medieval ideas, and he's contrasting them with modernism. And because we exist within it, we're like the fish in the ocean, right? We can't see the water because we're in it. When we see these ideas, they might seem new and fresh, but actually they're old and they're ancient. And that's what Lewis does so well. Is he gives us ideas that have been around for centuries. And somehow we open a book or we read something he said, and it's like, how has no one ever said this before? And then you read some more, like, oh, wait, Lewis is just pointing me back to people who have said this for ages, right?
Yeah. Maybe a better way to put it would be so I'm not going to say the name of the book, but I'm reading what would be considered a classic of Russian literature, and I'm reading in a more updated translation. I tried to read a translation from the
Why are you not saying the name of the book? Is it like a secret or?
No.
Oh, okay.
I just want to add a little mystery to it.
Oh, okay. That's fine.
I'm reading a translation from. I tried reading a translation from the 1900s, and then I found a more recent translation. Yeah. And the more recent translation is so much easier to understand.
Sure.
It's the same story, but just they're using a few more like modern ways of doing stuff, and I feel like it just makes it easier, more accessible. And maybe that's what Lewis was doing. He was taking old ideas and just presenting them in this new, like more modern way. And Mere Christianity was originally for the radio, and that was pretty modern too. People were hearing the Bible out loud thousands of years ago, but to hear it over the radio is something different.
Sure. Yeah.
I love it. It's a great point.
Yeah. This is well, Dan. It's so great to hear the ways that Lewis has shaped you as a priest and as a leader of others. And so, thanks for sharing that with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for asking.
Well, before we go ahead and dive into chapter 12, I have one addendum from earlier in this season that I wanted to go over. So way back in chapter 5, when we first met Puddleglum, we talked about, do you remember this, Phil? We talked about Fred Paxford, who was Lewis's gardener. Mm-hmm. And we kind of said, well, some people say that Puddleglum is based off of Paxford, and then some people don't. And the more that I've read, it was literally only Marvin Hinton was the only scholar I found who doesn't agree that this is based off of Paxford. Mm-hmm. And as I've just been doing more reading throughout
Paxford or Paxton?
I thought it was Paxford.
Okay. I thought you said Paxton earlier.
Did I say Paxton? I probably did throw a different name out there. Fred Paxford. Yeah. But so everyone else that I'm hearing says that Puddleglum is based off of Paxford. And in fact, previous guest of the show, Matt Bush over at Pints with Jack, he's interviewed Gresham twice in the last 6 months or so. And Gresham himself even talked about Puddleglum being based off of Paxford. So I just wanted to clear that up because we kind of had left it up in the air for our listeners to decide. And the more research I'm doing, it sounds like that's not really up for debate, unless you're Marvin Hinton, who we respect in a lot of other ways. But yeah.
Well, it's good to have that settled.
Yeah, absolutely.
I thought you were going to say we heard from the gardener himself.
No, we did from Paxford, yeah. He called into the show.
Send us a telegram.
Yeah. Well, and that leads us then to what we covered in our last episode. So in chapter 11, in our last episode, Eustace, Jill, and Puddleglum, they set Prince Rilian free from his enchantment. He destroyed the silver chair, and the chapter ended with this cliffhanger of the gnomes coming up to the chamber, and that's where it left off. So Phil, it's an even chapter. Do you have a summary for us?
I do. Here we go. Upon seeing the prince free and the chair destroyed, the witch dismisses her earthmen and locks the door. Prince Rilian states that he is now freed from his spell and requests safe passage back to the overworld. Silently striding across the room, the witch takes out green powder and tosses it in the fire. As the sweet smoke fills the room, she begins playing a mandolin-like instrument in a monotonous manner, and questioning whether their overworld and even Narnia and England really exist. The children and Puddleglum resist, but eventually find themselves believing that their homes were just figments of their imaginations. Desperately, Puddleglum marches over to the fire and scorches his foot, shocking himself and the children back to reality. The witch transforms into a serpent and attacks them all. After a brief struggle, they eventually slay the beast and make plans to escape.
Well done. And what a chapter this is.
This was one of the chapters where I was reading it and I was halfway through and I wanted to just message you and say that I was really, really, really stoked about this chapter.
Yeah.
And then I remembered that we had Dan on as a guest and I was even more excited.
Sure.
And then I remembered what you had said actually, that I think this had been a sermon illustration at some point by Dan, right?
Yes, that's right. I limit myself to one Narnia reference per year. So this was the one allotted for this past year. Yeah.
Yeah.
Growing up, we had a Lord of the Rings reference a year.
There you go.
And
in your church?
A few Matrix references sprinkled in.
I love it.
Every few years. But, yeah.
So good.
Well, Dan, what are your overall initial thoughts on this chapter before we go ahead and break it down, kind of, one bullet point at a time?
Yeah. God, well, so it's an incredible chapter. I mean, in many ways, Daniel, you and I were talking about this earlier. It really is the climax of the Silver Chair, and so the two children in Puddleglum, they're finally face to face with the prince they've been searching for, with this enemy that has kind of been lurking in the shadows. You sort of know at some point you're going to meet the enemy, but here she is. And one of the things that I find so fascinating about this chapter is that, and I think it's just very artful storytelling, that the thing you think is going to happen when the Lady of the Green Kirtle walks into the room is you think immediately there's going to be an epic battle. And instead, the very first thing she does is try to lull them into a false sense of security. Mm-hmm. And it just occurs to me that this is so often, I think, what happens in all kinds of different areas in life where you encounter something truly dangerous, but it's like it's a seductive danger. And one of the most dangerous things about it is that it tells you it's not dangerous. And I had a friend the other day that said something. I was talking with him, and we were talking about just the challenge of seeking to be a Christian in the 21st century, and how kind of like fantastically implausible that is becoming for so many people. And and he said this, and I'll never forget it. He said, Dan, I think the iPhone is the greatest threat to discipleship in the 21st century. And so it was like, of all the things he could have said, like the coronavirus or, politics or, all the things he could have said, instead he was like, no, this device that makes everyone's lives so much easier, this I think is actually the greatest threat. And I'm not bringing that up to be controversial at all. I just think it's an example of something that appears to be unthreatening, but actually is secretly, potentially destructive.
That is it's interesting to have this story from so long ago be brought into, again, modern terms with something that is so ubiquitous as a smartphone.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not quite as attractive as the beautiful mandolin-like instrument that the lady plays here.
I was really hoping you would bring yours, by the way.
I did not bring my mandolin at home.
I wanted to have some copyright-free music playing.
Yeah, you want me to play it while we do it? Well, let's go ahead and dive into this, because Dan, you already got us started. Now we've got to dive in here. So our three travelers plus the newly added fourth companion of Rillian, they all quickly encounter the Lady of the Green Kirtle, who returns from, I guess she was at the diggings. That's where Rillian told us she was in the last chapter. She returns from the diggings, and the first words out of her mouth are, "Leave us," which is a little terrifying.
Yeah. Do you connect this to any movies that you've seen in the past 20 years?
Of course, I'm thinking of Star Wars.
Yeah. This line was lifted directly from the story and placed into Star Wars episode.
Is it Return of the Jedi? Doesn't the Emperor say that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think. No, yeah, he doesn't say it in the third one. He says it in the sixth one. You're right.
Yeah. Maybe he also said. Okay, we're not going to go back and forth. He might also say it when Yoda comes in during the.
No, Yoda just drops him.
Yeah. Yoda knocks him out with the Force. That's right. So that's, yes, but I think that it is obvious that George Lucas was, when he was helping to create the story for Return of the Jedi, this "leave us" here was a pull from Narnia. It has to be.
It's a direct reference.
How else would those two words fit together without it being from Narnia? George Lucas, the secret Narnia fan.
That's right.
I love it.
Write that book.
So all of this happens, and Dan, like you said, we might expect some great fight to break out between Rillian and the Green Lady here, who we're gonna, I guess we can just call the witch moving forward. And instead, she just asks him, like, "Hey, what's going on here? Like, I'll give you time to explain what's happening here."
Which is simultaneously such a power play, just like a demonstration of power. She doesn't flip out. She just feels like she's still in control. And then she just remains calm and then kind of continues her plan like there's nothing wrong.
Dan, do you ever do this with your kids where you come into a room, you're like, what's happening here? Does someone want to explain this?
Oh my gosh, it's such a Jedi mind trick. Like if you can walk into a room where like some kid has gotten into something that they absolutely know they're not supposed to get into, and you just come and you kind of sit down and you go, "Tell me about your day." And it's like, oh my gosh. And you just watch them squirm as they try to figure out, like, have I been caught? Does he notice?
Yeah.
Do I tell the truth or do I back away slowly?
And really, in that kind of same vein, his response to all of this is he almost plays along, right? He plays along with the witch here, where he's like, "Hey, like there is no more." He says, "Madam, there will be no more need of that chair." He's like, "These friends here, they've saved me. They've helped they've helped to break the spell." And he's, "Aren't you so excited about this? I can finally leave and go back to being king." He's almost kind of calling her bluff here, right?
It's almost one last chance.
Mm-hmm.
Saying, "Hey, here's what happened. I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt, and now let's see what you do."
Mm-hmm. He also correctly identifies himself as king, the king's son of Narnia, Rilian, the only child of Caspian, 10th of that name, who some call Caspian the Seafarer. So this is really an acknowledging and kind of accepting his identity, as well as the soon to be king of Narnia. Caspian's already pretty old. We know that.
Right.
That's so good.
Phil, how does the witch respond to this?
She says nothing at all. And then she grabs some green powder, which she apparently keeps next to the fireplace. She doesn't even have it on her. She's like, this stuff is just over on the
I think it's some kind of like incense there. Helps to make the room smell nice.
I guess so.
Yeah.
Or people more malleable. I don't know.
So can we actually, before we dive into this, I want to pause right here because you mentioned the color green, and I want to talk about this. The color green appears multiple times throughout this chapter, really multiple times throughout the book, but specifically in this chapter. And so I did some digging here.
By digging, did you search for the word green in your Kindle version?
I did not actually do that, okay. But as I was reading, here's kind of what I came to understand. So we brought it up before. David Downing over at the Wade Center at Wheaton College, in his book Into the Wardrobe, he actually mentioned something about the Lady of the Green Kirtle that I had not picked up on at all. He pointed out that kirtle is usually actually used to describe a man's tunic. We talked about before that it's kind of this medieval outfit, but I didn't know this. It's often used more to describe something a man would wear, yet we have this woman here. And then, speaking of the color green, he pointed out that one of the few medieval texts where we see a woman wearing a kirtle is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the famous part of the Arthurian legend. Are either of y'all familiar with the story?
Yeah, it's been a while, but yes. Yeah.
Okay. Are you familiar, Phil?
Not very much.
All right. I will give you the kind of like very basic plot line because you should go read this. And any of our listeners who have not read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, it is one of my favorite stories of all time. And just to give you something exciting, here, let me just tell it first. So Sir Gawain is a knight in the Arthurian legend, and I think it's like on New Year's Eve or something. They're having some feast, and in comes a very large green knight, and he offers a challenge to the court and says, "I will let someone give me a blow with their sword, and then if I can return that in 1 year and a day." Well, Sir Gawain, he's feeling pretty brave. He gets up, chops the dude's head off. You think, oh, this is a wise thing to do because he can't return it. Except Green Knight picks his head up and leaves like, see you in a year, man. And so that's all I'll say. Besides, it's a story that you get to explore the idea of chivalry, kind of the lead up to like, what is this next year like? And then Gawain traveling and actually going to meet this knight. And I don't want to say anything more because it's a great story.
My interest is piqued. That's all I needed to want to read that.
Good. If that's not interesting enough, one of the most famous modern translations from the last 100 years is by none other than J.R.R. Tolkien.
Oh, excellent.
His version is a little bit dense. It's a little bit tricky to get through. So I'll also put out that there is a much simpler version of the text to read by Roger Lancelin Green, who is also an inkling. Green has a whole book. I think it's called like King Arthur and His Knights. We actually use it with my sixth graders. It's a really easy book to get through. And so for any of our listeners that haven't read this story, or it maybe just seems interesting to them to go back and reread it, highly recommend both Tolkien's version and Green's version. Both inklings. How cool is that?
What are the odds?
So I know that's a little bit of an aside, but I bring this up because the Green Knight's wife, she wears a green kirtle, and in it there is some seduction. And so what we're seeing here is something that I think has to be a clear connection that Lewis is pulling from in his role as a medieval scholar, which I thought was a really cool thing. So that, again, I did not uncover any of that. David Downing did, but I thought I should share that with us because I thought it was really cool.
Yeah, I'm glad you did. That's fun.
That's really neat. Daniel, while you were talking, I looked over at my bookshelf and I saw that I still have my copy of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight from high school.
Nice.
And I flipped it open, and I was reminded. So the copy I have is translated and edited by Brian Stone, and I was reminded of a little essay that he wrote at the end where he talks about how, and I think this don't worry, we're going to circle back to Silver Chair here, but he talks about how the Green Knight is, sort of plays this role in the story of the fundamental adversary, and Brian Stone calls him the kind of enemy, the common enemy of man, and that the role of the Green Knight in the Sir Gawain story is really sort of like the role of Satan in the story of Job. It's the common enemy who comes to tempt and to disrupt. And so when I was thinking about all the different Chronicles of Narnia and thinking, gosh, do we have any other characters who really embody like the same kind of role in the story of that common enemy, that like almost you almost want to use the word satanic, that satanic role. And I think the lady in the green kirtle probably comes closest to that role of all the different characters we meet.
That's a really good point.
It's pretty refreshing to have a completely evil character. You don't always get that. I feel like there's always like a little more sympathy, or it's not as clear. Like they do some things well, but she's pretty bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the only one that I can think of that we've covered so far would be the White Witch, right?
Right. Which
I think we should take a little bit of time to dive into. There's this weird, like rumor. That's not the right way to say it. There's this weird theory with some people in the Narnian community that the White Witch and let's call her the Green Witch here are somehow related. But I can't find any kind of connection between the two, besides them both being witches. So the only thing I can think of is, as I was reading back, is that Barbara Kellerman, do you remember her, Phil? She played the White Witch back in the BBC's adaptation of Lion, Witch in the Wardrobe. She also played the Lady of the Green Kirtle in The Silver Chair, which I haven't watched since I was a kid.
Really?
We're going to watch it.
As a joke, I was going to ask, if you were the director of the Silver Chair movie, would you cast Tilda Swinton as... even with heavy makeup as the Lady of the Green Kirtle?
Well, they really did. And so it seems like for a lot of people, there might have been some... That's kind of where this fan theory started of them being the same people. But it doesn't make sense. Aslan clearly says that, she's been defeated at the end of Lion, Witch in the Wardrobe. And it almost would like undo, Aslan's defeat of the White Witch to be like, and she appeared, later on down, 1,000 years in Narnian time later.
Yeah. Cool. Some fun connections there. I'm glad you brought up that.
Man, I really want to go back
stuff.
and read Gawain and the Green Knight. It's so good.
Yeah.
So all of this is happening. This whole discussion is happening while the witch is playing her seductive song, and she starts saying some really weird things you don't expect her to say. She starts telling the heroes of our story, that the world above doesn't exist. And she starts off saying, like, what's Narnia? What are you guys talking about, Narnia? I don't know what that is. She's, there's no land called Narnia.
It's very gentle, very sweet, but she's treating them as children, which has happened a lot in this book in particular.
Yeah.
The giant's treating them like children. Now she's treating them like children. Even Prince Aurelian, a couple chapters ago, was treating them like children, patting Lucy on the head and everything.
Yeah.
But yeah, she makes them kind of question everything. And at first, they're not really falling for it too much. They're resisting pretty hard, but over time, with the help of some green powder, they really start to believe what she's saying.
And Lewis he clearly points out to us the seductive nature of all of this. He even uses some alliteration here. We have this sweet smell that's coming from the room that Eustace picks up on. He also describes the witch as having, you couldn't have heard of a lovelier laugh. This is not some, even the White Witch when she's described, she has like, her face is, what didn't he say, like as white as like sugar paper? So this is something like that. Icing sugar, not sugar paper, icing sugar. She's still described as beautiful, but almost in an otherworldly sense. Whereas the Lady of the Green Kirtle here is almost just this, like just beautiful. Just not like with an asterisk next to it. No, she's just actually beautiful.
Yeah.
And it's all of this is so seductive to the children and to Puddleglum and to Rillian.
Yeah.
So, Phil, this song continues, and the queen keeps asking them about not just the outside world, but other things in that world. What are some of the things she brings up?
She starts with the sun, and they try to describe the sun. They're already struggling. The noxious fumes are kicking in. But she says, "What's a sun?" And they're like, "Well, it's like a lamp, but bigger." And she just kind of repeats what they're saying and makes it sound silly.
Yeah.
Like, you're just making a big lamp, and that's fine in the dream world, but that's not real.
And right before that, they've almost kind of pulled out of the trance a bit. Puddleglum was like, wait, guys, that's, he pulls them slightly out of it, but then the witch goes back, and then, like you said, she attacks the sun. Such a fundamental part of our existence, right? Something that we all can relate to, can all think of. She goes right after the sun. Of it, you're right. She's going to get to Aslan, but we're not even there yet. And she asks about the sun, and then what does the prince say? Rillian's like, it's like that lamp. It's round and yellow and gives light to the whole room, but it's bigger. It's for the whole sky. He's not very eloquent in his description of it. And the witch responds with, what does the sun hang from? How could it just be up there in the sky? And then she says, she says, when you try to think out clearly what the sun must be, you cannot tell me. You can only tell me it is like the lamp. Your sun is a dream. And there's nothing in that dream that was not copied from the lamp. The lamp is the real thing. The sun is but a tale, a children's story. Mm. Should we just kind of park the car right here for a while? I feel like we should. Yeah. So I don't know about y'all, but it's hard for me to read this and not think about Play-Doh. It's really
the clay.
I can see the joke working in your head. It's just not quite there.
Like, speaking of childlike references, maybe you guys didn't have Play-Doh growing up.
It's no, I'm not thinking of the best children's toy ever. I'm instead thinking of the allegory of the cave, right? Mm. And I know we're not supposed to say allegory on this show. That's kind of the word that we've banned.
Suppose what we did.
But it's hard to not think of Plato's allegory of the cave from the Republic. I'm assuming you both are familiar with the allegory of the cave.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, they're bound up. They've never been out, and they're only watching shadows.
Exactly. Yes. And I was thinking about how what the witch is doing is questioning, right, their reality. She's saying, no, that small thing, that lamp is the actual reality, in the same way that in that dialogue, Socrates is talking to somebody. I can't remember who it is. But he's, there's the prisoner who eventually escapes, and there's all these questions of, wait, what is reality? Because when the prisoner was in the cave, you're looking at the wall and you're seeing the shapes, and that is your reality right at that point. But then when they escape, and then I think at the end the prisoner comes back, and the other prisoners just kind of think that the other person's lost their mind, mm-hmm. right? And that's what's happening to our characters. Their reality is being shaken, and they don't really have the words to kind of push back against the witch.
Right. But just because they don't have the words to push back doesn't mean that their world doesn't exist. But they're finding it hard to prove that it does.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes them start to question it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, and to take it maybe even a step further, you know, you've already mentioned that C.S. Lewis was a medieval scholar, and I think a number of times he referenced himself as a dinosaur. Like he just felt like he spent all of his time immersed in this ancient world that you know his contemporaries kind of couldn't relate to. And of course we've referenced that you know the Narnia Chronicles are not allegorical. And so when I read this chapter, what I think I'm seeing and hearing is almost this echo of what C.S. Lewis's experience must have been like as a medieval scholar, you know, at Oxford, as you know, modernity is kind of moving in. It makes me think of what philosopher Charles Taylor has referred to as the immanent frame, where you know if you rewind the clock in history, you find a point in history where everybody believes in what he would call a spiritually enchanted world. You go back far enough and you don't have any atheists. You know, belief in spirituality is just the default setting for everybody. And you might have clashes over religion and doctrine, but it's a spiritually enchanted world. And then you have what philosopher Charles Taylor calls the immanent frame, where it's almost like the roof lowers. There's no longer a sky and heavens up there. It's just kind of a smaller encapsulated world where doubt and skepticism become the default setting. And as I kind of reread through this chapter, anticipating being on the podcast with you guys, it just got the wheels in my head turning on like, oh, this is what C.S. Lewis must have felt like. And what we're hearing in this chapter might not even have been intentional. It might just be an echo of his experience as a medieval scholar immersing himself in the spiritually enchanted world of the medieval times, where belief in spirituality is the default setting, but he's living in Oxford. And modernity is you know emerging, and doubt is actually the default setting with all of his contemporaries.
I'm so glad we brought Dan on.
Yeah, it's such a good point, and Peter Shackle goes into that more. Or is it Peter Shackle? I really can't remember. This is like par for the course for this podcast. But he talks about this in The Way into Narnia, which again, all the books that we talk about, we always will link in the episode's description. He calls this bottom-up mythology, right? What's happening here is that, you know, the modern view of mythology, right? It posits that we created, let's talk about, you know, later on we're going to get to Aslan, but let's just talk about the sun. We created the sun, if we want to think of it as this like divine thing that's otherworldly, as the witch is claiming it to be. We created that because we saw a lamp and we wondered, what if? We tried to create something better. So it's a hierarchical structure, but it starts at the bottom. Whereas like the ancients and the medievals, they always had a top-down mythology, which said the reason that we have a lamp, the reason that we have a cat, we're going to in a minute, is because there's the great cat, right? We see this, and this is biblical. This is us being made in the image of God. We don't go up and say, well, God is like us because humans crafted him to be like us. No, we are like God because he made us like him. It's top-down, not bottom-up. And hierarchy is not viewed very well in our modern society. The idea of authority, the idea of kind of a top-down approach is just not very palatable for many people. But yet that's the truth that Lewis is working with right here. And that's what the witch is fighting against.
Yeah. It makes me think of being in the world but not of the world. Is that the right way to phrase that? Yeah. And I feel like you know, Lewis is pretty aware of the truth, and it must be hard, especially, it's odd to me because I really know mostly of Tolkien and Lewis. To me, Oxford seems like a pretty spiritual place. But
yeah, it seems like a pretty Christian place to me.
Yeah. But, you know, I think that in reality it was probably very secular and still is. And just, that's really interesting to think about, that he was aware of that truth in such a difficult place to kind of express that.
Yeah, it's, Lewis really struggled, especially after writing the Screw Tape Letters. He was not very popular over in Oxford. He wanted written, popular literature outside of his own field, right?
Yeah.
And then it was very religious. And again, it wasn't. I mean, can you imagine just like a random professor at any university that's like, I teach, medieval history, and I just wrote a book about Christianity. It's the top seller at Crossway Books, or InterVarsity Press.
Yeah.
It would be weird. We would get like that person probably. I mean, I'm pretty like what most professors that write for InterVarsity Press all probably teach at Christian universities for the most part. I don't know how many University of Virginia or University of North Carolina professors are writing for IVP.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I see this happen all the time in kind of the startup world. Someone will become famous for one thing, but then they'll try to branch out into something else, and people just really struggle with that.
Yeah.
They really they question you. They're like, why are you doing this other thing that you're not known for?
Get back in your lane. Yeah.
So Phil, did you want to read a little part from this section of the chapter?
Yeah, so this fits in right with what we were talking about. They're trying to describe the lamp, and they're saying that it's the sun, or they're trying to describe the sun, and they're saying that the sun is this giant lamp that hangs from the sky, or hangeth from the sky. Hangeth from what, my lord? Asked the witch. And then, while they were all still thinking how to answer her, she added, with another of her soft, silver laughs, you see, when you try to think out clearly what the sun must be, you cannot tell me. You can only tell me it is like the lamp. Your sun is a dream, and there is nothing in that dream that was not copied from the lamp. The lamp is the real thing. The sun is but a tale, a children's story. Yes, I see now, said Jill in a heavy, hopeless tone. It must be so. And while she said this, it seemed to her to be very good sense. Slowly and gravely the witch repeated, there is no sun. And they all said nothing. She repeated in a softer and deeper voice, there is no sun. After a pause, and after a struggle in their minds, all four of them said together, you are right. There is no sun. It was such a relief to give in and say it. There never was a sun, said the witch. No, there never was a sun, said the prince, and the marshwiggle, and the children.
Wow. That's such a great part of the chapter. It was so great that I already read some of it on accident. I'm sorry. I get so excited. Man, the line that stands out to me the most is it was such a relief to give in and say it.
Right.
How seductive can, if we're thinking about modernity here or just our culture be when it's just like, it's so easy to just give in and be like, no, I don't want to be countercultural. I don't want to be, going against the grain. I just want to, it's a relief to give in and go along.
Everything would be easier, at least short term.
Yeah.
It would feel easier at first.
I was going to say, it reminds me a little bit of the moment in Prince Caspian when the four children all arrive in Narnia and Lucy is the only one that can see Aslan. And all of her siblings though they are doubting her. And Aslan's word to her is, courage, dear heart. And yeah, I don't know. There's something about the way the two of you read and then shared about that story just struck a note for me that it is just it just would be such a relief to give in and just say, you know what, I agree, you're right. And yet it's that moment of resistance which just requires so much courage. And I know that we'll get to Puddleglum's actions here in a minute, but yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I just want to point out that I've heard the phrase "courage, dear heart" a lot, and it still gives me goosebumps. When you said it just now, Dan, I got goosebumps again. It's just that's such a powerful phrase, especially when you know the story behind it. It's really well done. I also wanted to point out that the way that this section of the book is crafted, with the timing and just the calmness of the witch and the way she's playing and the way Lewis reminds us that she's still thumbing, is what he says. Just this gentle, monotonous tone coming through, and he keeps referring to it. He doesn't do it too much. He doesn't let you forget either. But then also just the way that he shows that one by one, kind of the two children start to say that, yeah, you're right. And then one more person, the prince says it, and then they're all saying it.
Yeah.
One at a time, she gets them all. And then even the way that one of them kind of wakes them back up, as we'll see here in a minute. And then one by one, they all kind of get back. It's just masterfully crafted.
And while we're giving her some compliments, what a great musician. She is playing and talking this entire time.
Right. She's not rushing. She's not dragging.
No.
It's just
right on tempo. I'm sure she's probably perfectly in key. I am impressed that she is thrumming, as Lewis states, while just talking. Not singing, just talk. I actually wish she was singing. Would that take a lot of the drama out of the scene, that she was singing everything towards him?
The Silver Chair musical.
Yeah, that
2024.
Netflix can adapt it when they do that. They can make it a musical.
Disney Plus, man.
Well, before we get to Puddleglum's act of resistance that Dan alluded to, there's we've walked through the sun and the lamp. Well, now there's the cat and the great cat, right? Aslan. And the witch even says, we're going to do no better with your lion, because it's Aslan, Puddleglum says, well, there's Aslan. And the witch is like, well, what does it mean? Tell me more what it means. And they're having a hard time describing a lion. Like, well, it's like a cat. That's what Eustace says. It's like a cat. It's bigger, and they can't get through it. The same problem they're having with the lamp all over again. But it hits us harder as readers, because this is Aslan. Right. He's the top dog. Well, sorry, he's the top cat.
Top cat.
There's no one greater than him in this world, and he doesn't exist to our characters. They've forgotten him.
Right.
And so it's in this moment that we eventually get up to what Puddleglum is going to do. Can I read real quick what happens and what he does?
Please do.
Before he says his very famous speech here. So Lewis writes, the prince and the two children were standing with their heads hung down, their cheeks flushed, their eyes half closed, the strength all gone from them, the enchantment almost complete. But Puddleglum, desperately gathering all his strength, walked over to the fire. Then he did a very brave thing. He knew it wouldn't hurt him quite as much as it would hurt a human, for his feet, which were bare, were webbed and hard and cold-blooded like a duck's. But he knew it would hurt him badly enough, and so it did. With his bare foot he stamped on the fire, grinding a large part of it into ashes on the flat hearth. And three things happened at once. Does anyone quiz? Does anyone remember what the three things are?
It's not fair. I've got the book right here in front of me.
It's okay. Well, you answer for us. Go for it.
Technically, we all do.
Yeah, it's amazing. So immediately I love the way Lewis phrases this. The room begins to smell very largely of burnt marshwiggle, and so it kind of
gotta smell awful.
It clears everybody's head. Yeah, immediately. That's the first thing that happens, and then the second thing is that the witch shrieks out in this loud voice and immediately stops strumming and stops singing sweetly, and her tone totally changes. And then the third thing is that the pain wakes Puddleglum up into alertness, and he's able to think clearly again.
And I love that so much because it takes the seduction out of this scene. Like the beautiful smell, not only does the beautiful smell go away, I think we are to assume that a worse smell enters in. That burnt marshwiggle, not a great smell. They do not make that at Yankee Candle.
There's something about that word, and just having had his feet described so many times, just I
don't like it either. And then the witch cries out, which we were joking earlier, but she's been kind of cool, calm, and collected this whole time. And for her to give out this shriek is the first time in this chapter she has shown herself to not be in control, right? Up until then, she has fully been in control of the situation. So that kind of pulls him out. And then with both of those things, both of those seductive elements gone, the pain brings Puddleglum's head clear so he can say what he's going to say.
Mm-hmm.
And Dan, were you going to read that, his very famous speech here?
Yeah, I'd love to. Side note, I think Lamppost listeners should start a line of Yankee Candles based on smells from the Narnia books. Yeah.
Yes. For our listeners, please write us in. Let us know what's the first line of Narnia Candles. Like, what are some of the ones we're going to have? I think we have to have like fresh flowers for the arrival of spring and wardrobe. But I want to know the more Narnian smells. A Turkish Delight has to be one, right?
Yeah. Tumnus's abode.
Do you think it smells good?
I think it's okay. It's probably like a lot of cinnamon and sugar. And
That's fair.
Sweet stuff. I do think that if we have this many people asking us to actually try Turkish Delight, we might need to burn our feet too. Just do like a coal walk or something. Is that a bad idea?
You can do that one, buddy. I'm gonna sit that one out.
All right, so here we go. Puddleglum's speech. "One word, ma'am," he said, coming back from the fire, limping because of the pain. "One word. All you've been saying is quite right. I shouldn't wonder. I'm a chap who always likes to know the worst and then put on the best face I can. So I won't deny any of what you said, but there's one thing more to be said, even so. Suppose we have only dreamed or made up all those things. Trees and grass, sun, moon, stars, and Aslan himself. Suppose we have. Then all I can say is that, in that case, the made-up things seem a good deal more important than the real things. Suppose this black pit of a kingdom of yours is the only world. Well, it strikes me as a pretty poor one. And that's a funny thing when you come to think of it. We're just babies making up a game, if you're right. But 4 babies playing a game can make a play world which licks your real world hollow. And that's why I'm going to stand by the play world. I'm on Aslan's side, even if there isn't any Aslan to lead it. I'm going to live like a Narnian, as I can, even if there isn't any Narnia. So thanking you kindly for our supper, if these 2 gentlemen and the young lady are ready, we're leaving your court at once and setting out in the dark to spend our lives looking for Overland. Not that our lives will be very long, I should think, but that's a small loss if the world's as dull a place as you say."
Oh, hurrah, good old Puddleglum is the response.
Yeah, snaps everybody out of it. What an amazing technique, by the way. He says, okay, yeah, maybe you're right. But if that's the case, and he just kind of, fake agrees with her and then presents his argument anyway, it also helps that she's already kind of lost her power or shown that she's losing power because she's lost her control.
Well, you bring up a good point, Phil, and I'd ask both of y'all this question. Is Puddleglum sincere here? Is he, Phil, you were kind of implying that he's kind of just going along. He's kind of saying this. But my question is, is that your thought, or do you think he's actually like, hey, I actually don't know what exists anymore, but I prefer this thing over what you're presenting to me?
Well, Puddleglum is notorious for saying stuff and you're not sure if he believes it or not.
That's true.
Or, yeah, when the thing I'm thinking of is when he was a little bit intoxicated from...
A little?
Yeah.
You're very generous with Puddleglum.
A lottle? He was drunk, and he was later saying that he wasn't really. He was just kind of playing it up a little bit. He was playing it up,
sure.
And he clearly believed it, or they thought he did.
Mm-hmm. I mean, is this... you've already brought up a little bit of philosophy, Dan, already. Is this Pascal's wager inside of Narnia? Is that what Puddleglum is doing here? Is this kind of a, hey, I don't know what's real, but I'm going to bet on the thing that probably will give me the best outcome here? Or is this a more faithful response?
Gosh, that's such a good question. For the listeners who might not be familiar, Pascal's wager basically says, look, if you believe in God and you're wrong, it doesn't really matter. If you don't believe in God and you're wrong, it doesn't really matter. If you believe in God and you're right, then everything's great. But if you don't believe in God and you're wrong, you are royally screwed. And so the whole Pascal's wager thing is like, hey, best bet out of all the given options is to believe in God. That's
which is such an enlightenment response to religion.
I know, yeah. So here's the thing. I'm actually gonna make an argument for why that's not what Puddleglum is doing.
Okay.
So I would say two things. One is, given what I know of C.S. Lewis, I think what he's doing is actually something we could all maybe hearken to, given that we do live in a secular age. But I think what Lewis is doing is he's using beauty as an apologetic. He's saying, look, Narnia is more desirable than this underground kingdom, and I think it's important to pay attention to, because given that all of us are living in a time where doubt is normal, and the default setting is unbelief for most of our peers. I think a lot of well-intentioned Christians, in an effort to reach out in well-meaning love to others, usually end up starting in the wrong place, and they try to argue people into Christian faith. In other words, they start with truth, and maybe somewhere along the way they'll hit beauty and goodness. And what Lewis is doing in this interaction is he's actually working it the other way around. He's saying he's starting with beauty and goodness, and then later he's going to get to truth. So first he's saying, look, what do you want? What do you want to be true? And then later they're actually going to, not to give anything away, but later they're going to figure out whether there actually is a sun up there, right? But first he's starting with, well, which is more desirable? And I think there's probably something for Christians to learn there. That I think it was either Tim Keller or some other kind of famous preacher talked about how one of the best things Christians can do is demonstrate the desirability of the Christian faith and the goodness of it, the beauty of it, and then later, if asked for and if desired, give the evidence for it. But don't try to start with the evidence, because it's a non-starter until the desire is there. On one hand, so that's maybe point one. I think that's what Lewis is doing. And the second reason, which I actually think is the kicker, this is why I don't think it's Pascal's wager, is that Puddleglum is showing that it is worth living like a Narnia, even if there is no Aslan's country to go to one day. And I think Puddleglum's speech can almost serve as something of a reprimand to Christians that basically treat Christianity as fire insurance, like, hey, believe in this so you don't go to hell, which is essentially what Pascal's wager is, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And what Puddleglum is saying is like, hey, actually, it's worth living this way, even if it doesn't lead to some great eternal reward afterwards.
Wow, yeah.
That's very eloquently put, Dan. And I think, yeah, reading this as just simply, I think I see where the allusions are made towards Pascal. There are clear ones here, but I think you're right that it almost undermines the faith of Puddleglum, especially knowing the context of how he has reacted over the last few chapters, especially since we've been in the underworld. I think it was a chapter or two ago where Rillian, while he's under his enchantment, he's like, hey, that under me that you saw earlier to get here, like that wasn't written for you. That was part of a grave of a giant a long time ago. Like, how silly that you believe that was for you. And Puddleglum has, right, the faith in the providence of Aslan, right, that he knew that it would say that when they showed up, that he is omniscient, he's able to do those things, he can see all of that. And so knowing that context, that Puddleglum has really been this kind of this rock of faith for the last few chapters, we know I agree with you, Dan, that there's so much more happening here with this faith, and it's not just some simple, hey, like your thing doesn't seem as good, and so I want to be over here in this thing.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really, I think it's a good explanation, Daniel. I think if it was Pascal's wager, I think what Puddleglum would say is, look, we're going to go looking for a way out in the dark, and if we die out there, that's okay. We'll just go to heaven, or we'll go to Aslan's country. But he doesn't say that. Mm-hmm. He says, no, it's worth living as a Narnian, even if we die down here.
Yeah. So after this revelation from Puddleglum, the witch just pretty much gives up and decides to transform into a snake, which kind of feels like it came out of nowhere, except
for the fact
that you do it.
Well, I was thinking the same thing. it seems kind of random, except for the fact that that's what Prince Rillian was supposedly going to do a chapter ago.
Well, no, I wasn't even thinking of that. That is true. And
oh, you're connecting it all the way to the very beginning.
the book, right?
Yeah.
That's what killed his mother.
Right.
It was a snake. And so we learned that it not only has the Green Witch been responsible for, which I don't think is her real name, but I like that name. The Green Witch, not only responsible for Rillian's enchantment, but also for the death of his mother. Well, speaking of death, a very quick fight ensues here, and Rillian, Puddleglum, and Eustace chop up the slippery snake here, and that's the end.
Right. This is an interesting chapter. It seems like 90% build up, and then it's over in just about a page.
Well,
very quick battle.
It makes sense though, because just as Dan already mentioned, right, that this is the climax of the book. The climax isn't the fight with the snake. The climax is Puddleglum's faith overcoming all of the witch's seduction. That's the real climax. The battle is just the same way that back in Wardrobe, Aslan defeating the deep magic, or defeating death through the deeper magic. That's the real climax. And then they get all the witches stuff, all of her castle, and that battle. That's just stuff that just has to get done. That's just what we have to do before bedtime, right? Aslan even says in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, we've got to do this if we're to defeat the witch before bed or before supper, whatever. It's the same thing here.
That's true confidence.
The battle is just a formality that needs to happen after our faith, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's where the chapter ends. It's a sudden ending there. They decide there's some wine, so they get a little bit of wine first, and then they say it's time to move out. All right. Well, in the next chapter of the podcast, we are going to be reading chapter 13, and that chapter is called Underland Without a Queen. Well, Dan, I know that you are on a bit of a time crunch, so we'll let you head out here. This has been wonderful having you on the show. You've brought so much just great thoughts to today's episode, and we're really thankful for that.
Yeah, thanks for bringing all your knowledge and just experience and history with these books. It's been fun.
Yeah.
Guys, it's been great to be on the show. Thanks so much for having me on. I think... I think the world of both of you, and I love Narnia, love the Lamppost Listener. I'll recommend it to all my friends. Thanks for having me on, and if Lewis comes back and writes another book, I'll come back on the show and talk about it.
Yeah, excellent.
Well, great. Thanks so much for being on the show, Dan. We really appreciate it.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for joining us. It was great to have you.
Well, Phil, this feels like old times. You remember back when we first started the show, we used to always kind of come back later and record some listener feedback after we'd recorded the full episode.
And then append it. And
Yeah.
Now we're doing it again.
Now we're here doing a little bit more. Before we let everybody go for Chapter 12, we did want to go over one email that we got that we thought related really well to this particular chapter. And it's an email from Demos, who's written into the show many times before, and he gave us his thoughts on the Lady of the Green Kirtle. And just before he went into his email, I wanted to mention that he talked about how he's a little behind on our show because of the pandemic. It's been really hard for him to catch up without a commute, and I just wanted to say, I understand.
Yeah, you had the same issue for a while.
I did. When I was not able to go into work, it was the same thing where I was just falling behind on all the things that I was doing. And I get it. I really am happy to be driving again to get that back into my schedule.
Wow.
Well, Phil, do you want to go ahead and read this email?
Sure. So this is from Demos. I've always thought that the best way to start a film adaptation of The Silver Chair would be to open with Rillian and his mother and her tragic death by the Green Serpent. The next scene would cut to Experiment House with Jill and Eustace and their journey into Narnia. It bothers me when people suggest that the Lady of the Green Kirtle is Jadis. They have totally different personalities, for one thing. Just as Jadis came into Narnia from another world and tried to conquer it, so too must have the Lady of the Green Kirtle. We don't need to know her backstory. I like how Lewis plays up the medieval concept of chivalrous devotion to a lady and the relationship between Rillian and the Queen. There's a lot of high Middle Ages in Narnia, which I wish would be emphasized by filmmakers. Anyway, keep up the wonderful work. Sincerely, Demos. That's a really good point. I think that if the White Witch could get in, this witch could get in too and try to conquer. Mm-hmm. And if it's kind of fun to think about the different portals and the different ways people could get in. That's fun.
Yeah, and I picked this email because this is the end of the Lady of the Green Kirtle, and this is kind of the last time we'll have a big discussion about her. And I agree with Demos, which you mentioned earlier already in this episode, that they're just different people. I tried really hard. I love digging into all this stuff and coming up with, I love all the theories and everything. I can't get behind this one at all. They're just not the same character. It seems to me they have magic and they're ladies. Like that's the similarity. So I agree with him. They're just very different people. And I like that we don't have her backstory. I like that we know nothing about this character. We pretty much know nothing about her. Yeah. I feel like we knew more about the White Witch than we knew about through Mr. and Mrs. Beaver's exposition.
There's so much power in having a mystery background for a character that never gets revealed. This is a little bit more difficult because technically the character does have a backstory, but the Joker in Christopher Nolan's Batman, you don't get a backstory.
Yeah.
And for the majority of people who haven't read multiple comics or seen...
They don't have all that with them, yeah.
Yeah, don't have all that history. It's pretty fun to have this character. You don't know where he came from. He's just there, and he wrecks havoc the whole movie, and then he's gone.
Yeah.
You get nothing. But what you imagine in your head is probably going to be worse for each individual person than anything that a screenwriter could come up with.
By the way, speaking of The Dark Knight, I put a poll out about The Dark Knight Rises, which we talked about recently. Everybody agreed with you.
Oh, really?
yeah, everybody liked it. I did not realize how few people... I thought people didn't like the movie. It seems like everybody but me liked it. Yeah. So,
well, I had one friend I'll never forget. He said, "You like that? I thought it was a little comic booky," and I just stared at him. And
that's
why
away. That's why I don't like it.
Yes, I think it's a comic book.
Sorry, I thought you should know that people agree with you. Demos also brings up another great point here about the adaptations, and I wanted to. I love the way he talked about opening it, not necessarily opening in our world. I like that. I also wanted to ask you, Phil, any of our listeners, maybe what they think too. I have to assume now, having just recently watched Dawn Treader, the 2010 movie, that green mist, I think that was supposed to eventually somehow be related to this. I think, remember, they were trying to kind of string all the movies together, and I wonder if Tilda Swinton was going to play the Lady of the Green Kirtle, who would have secretly been the White Witch. Because that green mist and that color green is associated with this antagonist and all. I think there's something there.
Yeah. I love stuff where they were obviously hinting at something to have a connecting thread through an entire series, but then it got cut short. Can you think of an example?
Like The Amazing Spider-Man 2?
Yep.
I saw it once in theaters.
Oh, no. I'm actually talking about the original Spider-Man.
With the lizard guy?
No, the person who was going to play Mysterio.
You mentioned this on the podcast before. I don't think I remember this.
Yeah. There's a special place in my heart for that kind of stuff. Sure. Because it's so cool when Marvel does it. There's a connecting thread through all 20 plus movies now. Yeah. But
all right, well, now that we're talking about comic book movies again, I think that is the time that we should wrap up the show. Since you read the email, Phil, I'll go ahead and wrap us up.
All
right, well, before our regular end credits, we just wanted to give one final thanks to Dan Marotta for joining us in this chapter. It was a really great time, and we're so thankful that he was with us for Chapter 12. Now, this episode is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can listen to a bonus episode each month along with other rewards. Special thanks goes to Elias Dean, John Marr, Emily Margaret, and Ryan Smith for supporting us at our top tiers. You can follow us into Narnia on our Twitter or Facebook pages, although I think, to be honest, Phil, I don't have Facebook, and I don't think you check it. So we're on Twitter. Do we do anything on Facebook?
Yeah, send us an email or leave us a voicemail.
Yeah.
I think would be the best at this point.
Yeah, we should probably not. Yeah, I don't think the Facebook gets updated anymore because it's just we're not over there as much. But we're on Twitter. I'm on Twitter. You can come follow me. All the tweets that you like are mine. All the ones you dislike are Phil's. So but also like Phil
For
said,
those of you at home, Daniel is throwing green powder into the into the fireplace and saying not truths.
But yes, email is always a really great way to reach us, and that's at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com. You can also call us and leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. As always, we would appreciate a review on Apple Podcasts. We are almost, Phil, at 100 reviews over on Apple Podcasts.
Heck
which is
yeah.
great.
That's great.
So thank you to all of y'all who have already done that. And again, that helps other listeners find the show and join together on our read through. Again, if you haven't subscribed to, make sure you subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you can wake up to a new episode every other Wednesday. Thank you so much for coming along on this journey, and we will be back next time with Chapter 13.